good morning to everybody. Very international welcome. I know we have listeners all around the world from the United States. A very early good morning to you there throughout the UK and the rest of Europe. And bonjour à tous et bienvenue to our French listeners as well. My name is Skylar Szymanski. I am the Demand Generation Manager here at Incentive in the heart of Paris this morning. And all the way from Australia, thank you for joining us. The listeners out there are very late, but good evening to you as well. And that is also the home country of our featured guest speaker this morning, all the way from Melbourne. It's a pleasure to welcome Mr. Graham Hawkins, founder, CEO, mentor, and of course, best-selling author from SalesTribe. Thank you for being here today with us, Graham.
Pleasure, Skylar. Thanks for having me, and good morning to you.
Absolutely. Well, good evening to you. So this is obviously quite a controversial subject. We're going to be kicking off this month-long Future of Sales webinar series here that we're hosting at Incentive with this, which is no commissions, no quotas. Is this really the future of sales? And before we delve too deep into the specific tactics and strategies of this, how about you give us a little bit more background about where you came from and how you arrived at this position and how you're compelled to discuss it with sales leaders worldwide this morning.
Yeah, look, certainly. And I should say right off the bat, I think, Skylar, that, a lot of what I'm going to say might sound a little bit hypocritical here because I've spent my entire career, almost 3 decades, working to a quota and working to revenue attainment and being paid a commission. So for me to come out now all of a sudden and proclaim that, commissions and quotas are no good seems, as I say, seems hypocritical. But yeah, my career is all sales, B2B sales, from the age of 19. I'm 48 now, so about 28 years almost in B2B sales and sales leadership roles, primarily with US software companies selling in the high-tech space. I've worked mostly across the Asia Pacific region and spent some time living and working also in the UK. So in 2012, I had one of those light bulb moments where I was doing my MBA at that point. I started that whole thing pretty late. So the research project that I focused on was around the changing nature of buyer behaviour. And so 5 years ago, I started to see a lot of change in the way buyers were going about engaging with businesses. And we're all seeing the changing nature of that now. And so when I finished the research project, I decided there was a little book in this, and I wrote my first book called Sales Transformation. And it was at that stage I started to go out and interview buyers specifically about what it's like for them to engage with vendors and vendor salespeople. And the overwhelming feedback, Skylar, was that the old models, the old push selling models, the interruptive push models that had the salesperson almost pitted against the buyer more or less as an adversary. Those models are no longer acceptable in some B2B circles, some industries. So I started delving into this a little bit deeper. And the more feedback I got from buyers about the way they want to be sold to, or in fact the way they want to buy and not be sold to, the more I started to realize that the old way of measuring, managing and rewarding salespeople is just no longer in line with where buyers want to be. So I wrote this post as you would have seen for Sales for Life originally, the guys in Toronto, and I said, look, we've got to stop measuring and managing salespeople according to a quota. It just creates self-interest. It creates those vested interests in the salesperson that really precludes there being a fully trusting relationship. Buyers are aware of everything now. They know that the salesperson's carrying a quota. They know they're going to get a commission. And so consequently, they know that, can they really fully trust that the salesperson is going to make the right recommendation for them when that self-interest is there. So I wrote that post. It went viral. It created a lot of controversy. And thankfully, since then, there's a number of other people that are now also starting to reiterate this message. So that's a little bit about my background and how I've arrived at this new model.
Great. Well, I'm glad you brought up that article because it became the most read article on the Sales for Life platform. And as you said, went absolutely viral and inspired a lot of discussion. And I want to refer to that specifically. You wrote that, quote, business should never be a game of win-lose. With the current quota and commission system, who's losing?
It's a good question. So back to my point before about the salesperson almost needing to conquer the buyer. There's this adversarial relationship, because for all of my career, even though I took right from day one, I took the approach that I would place integrity at the heart of everything I do. Deep down, I know that the manager back in the office wants to know, what does the pipeline look like? Am I going to make quota? And that's a binary number, isn't it? You either make quota or you don't. And so it's very difficult for B2B salespeople to park that and just focus on delivering the perfect solution for the buyer. And that sometimes, as you know, sometimes means walking away or saying to the buyer, listen, our solution, there's no fit. So I need to, strategically withdraw from this bid that we're working with, because I don't think it's in your best interest. It's difficult for salespeople to do that. So yeah, I think the win-lose scenario, when a salesperson is being measured, and look, the facts are, and this is widely held view, that the vast majority of B2B salespeople are now failing. Somewhere between 60 and 80% are failing to meet or exceed quota. So it's getting harder and harder, and that tends to breed, in some people, not all, I'm going to make some generalizations here, but it tends to breed desperation. And I've seen throughout my almost 3 decades, I've seen some pretty unsavory tactics used by desperate salespeople. And when that happens, there's often a win-lose. And you and I talked, I think a while ago, we talked about this feeling of post-purchase dissonance. When a buyer's been led into buying a product that they perhaps shouldn't have bought, there's that feeling of regret. And sometimes, as I say, that's it's borne out in this win-lose scenario. Business should be, if you think about it, it should be win-win. Vendor wins when the customer's happy, lifetime customer value, and all of those metrics become more important now than they ever have.
No, exactly. And in one of those conversations that we had, you said that no matter the integrity of your intentions, you will end up reverting back to that self-interest if you have the wrong incentives.
100%. And look, as I say, I feel for salespeople. I am a sales guy. I'm happy to admit that. I've always been on the side of salespeople. And I know that, sales leaders and senior management are putting lots and lots of pressure on these guys now to perform. It is getting more difficult to engage with educated and demanding buyers. And so, salespeople are really under a lot of pressure. And it is very difficult when you're trying to cling to your job in some cases. You've missed quota for 2 quarters in a row. In some companies, that means you're out the back door. So it is really a tough situation. And if we keep pushing and managing and measuring and rewarding salespeople on those old metrics, we are going to continue to see some of that bad behaviour that we're seeing in some of the world's banks. I think we talked previously also about the fact that down here in Australia, the banking institution, financial institutions were under review recently for what was being talked about in the papers around some unsavoury tactics being used by frontline staff. And frontline staffs were being paid big commissions in some cases to put people into products, and this was just creating that sort of movement towards buyers being led down the wrong path in some cases. No surprise, the 12-month review led to an overhaul of the banking and financial institutions down here, such that frontline staff were removed, or the commissions were removed from frontline staff to encourage better behaviour. Right. And obviously customers are becoming much more educated, much more demanding, and rightfully so. Now, do consumers themselves take a position on this sales quotas? Is it something that they just feel the impact of, or are they actively aware of what sales quotas and commissions are doing to the buying process? Oh, look, I think all of us, we're all, whether you're in sales or you're not, we're all buyers, we're all consumers, we all go out into the market and buy things. I think all of us deep down know that a salesperson is being paid a commission, whether it's the used car salesman, whether it's the insurance salesman, whether it's your local plumber. Everybody's got a vested interest to some extent. And I think consumers are more aware now than ever before that there's this commercial discussion going on, or dynamic between the buyer and seller. So, you know, we're all a little bit wary as buyers or consumers. We're a little bit wary of being told something that's not quite right. And the proof point there is we're all using comparison websites. We're all using independent advocacy like Amazon reviews and TripAdvisor and all of these things to get reassurance that what the guy down the road told me is actually accurate. So I think as consumers, we know what's going on.
No, that is very true, and that urgency of the sale becomes a little bit less urgent when you do have these other platforms that you can research on. No longer is the salesperson the sole source of information on that purchase.
100%. And look, Mark Zuckerberg said it himself, there's nothing more powerful than that trusted referral. So we often, as buyers now, or consumers and business buyers too, they seek reassurance, they seek a trusted referral from someone else about a vendor. We had a classic case down here in a previous role about 4 years ago where we won a big deal with one of the major banks here, and we invited, after the deal was done, it was a multi-million-dollar deal. After the deal was done and booked, we invited the customer in to talk to the wider sales team about why we won this deal. Mm-hmm. And I'll shorten the story for you, but the guy from the bank, the senior official at the bank, said, listen, it had nothing to do with your product. And sorry, Mr. Sales Guy, it had nothing to do with you. We took the decision to go with you guys because we see you as a safe pair of hands. We see you as a vendor who can deliver on your promise. So this, you know, again, this whole promise, the consideration, the engagement, the agreement that you put in place with your buyer is so critical now. You can't mess that up anymore.
No, it's very, very true. It's becoming a much longer-term relationship. Now, one thing that I'm sure a lot of sales leaders have questions about is they go, okay, fine, no quotas. What would you put in place of those? What KPIs would be able to sufficiently replace a system that has more or less worked for many decades and has become a staple of the industry?
Well, let's start with the basics. Every single vendor on the planet now realizes that retaining your existing customers is critical. So retention rates, is an obvious one. How do you make sure that every customer you've got is really, really happy with the experience of engaging with you? I mean, Forrester's got their CX pyramid that they talk about. You know, everyone's striving to get to the top, which is, you know, how do you be enjoyable to do business with? So if you start with that as the basis, lifetime customer value, how do you make sure those customers stay with you and continue to repeat purchase over and over and over again? So when I started to talk with some clients down here in Asia Pac about you know, how they were structuring their compensation plans, we started to talk about retention rates and possibly paying salespeople on the second and third sale rather than the first sale. Things like customer loyalty, NPS scores, customer satisfaction rates. There's a myriad of other much more buyer-centric measurements and metrics that we can put in place to actually performance manage salespeople, rather than just default to that old, we finger in the air. We want this amount of revenue this year. We had X last year, so we'll put 10% on what we had this year. That's just, it's so lazy, really. There's a lot of other really important metrics that we can use, and thankfully, we are now starting to see some savvy vendors putting in place exactly this.
No, it's very true. It's becoming much more of a lifetime value proposition, and as you stated in another one of our conversations, 70% of that lifetime value is now generated post-sale, hence the rise of microtransactions and really needing to nurture that customer throughout the process. So the idea being that, and I believe you wrote this in your Sales for Life article, that the sales team members need to become part of more of a collective customer success team, that they're working with the rest of the organization. It's not that these revenue objectives are completely detached from the customer anymore.
Correct. Look, there's a myriad of people talking about this stuff now, and Tatango is an organization, you may have heard of them in the US. Their CEO said recently that when you consider that the average order value for that initial sale is coming down, more and more people doing pilots and trials, and the consumption-based SaaS models means that the big sale that you used to get in the old days is now a little sale, and we've got all these microtransactions that go on after that initial sale. So yeah, apparently 70% or thereabouts of lifetime customer value revenue is being generated post the initial sale. And when that happens, that obviously means 30% is being attributed to the sales team, and in some cases where businesses have a customer success team, then 70% is coming or being attributed to the customer success team. So balancing up who gets rewarded and who gets commission and who doesn't, it all should be collectively, in my humble opinion, it should be one big team: marketing, product management, pre-sales, sales, customer success, all working around the one common objective, and that is to give the customer the delightful experience that they now demand.
Very true. And there's obviously the flip side of that. You have the quotas on the front end, and then beyond personal fulfillment and joining in this customer success team, how will sales reps specifically be motivated, incentivized to really go that extra distance? What can replace a commission?
Well, I've written in my book about my view of the future, and if you look at the trends and where it's headed, Skylar, I don't think salespeople are going to be in a position to command anything in the future. I mean, the B2B sales roles are gradually going like this, and it's getting harder and harder for salespeople. The old days of attracting and retaining sales staff, attracting talent through this great big commission plan, come and join us and you can earn $500,000 a year. I think those days are over. Natural market forces and the way vendors are looking to automate and create self-service opportunities to reduce the cost of acquisition. So salesperson's in the middle. Buyer wants to avoid salesperson wherever they can and get a better deal. And vendors are looking at, how do I create a more streamlined approach so that the salesperson isn't having to be paid $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year in commission. So there's this real pincer movement happening. And I think, if salespeople can get their head around being measured and managed on retention and customer advocacy and customer loyalty and those things, then we've got a different model and we've got a different world, and a world that's really one that I'm craving, and that is where the buyer and the salesperson is fully aligned. And I keep saying, when buyers change how they buy, sellers have to change how they sell. And not to go on about it, but if you look at commission and quota, the heritage of that goes back to 1884 when John H. Patterson, this is 130 years ago, when John H. Patterson first purchased NCR out of the US. He bought that company. He thought to himself, I need to create this model where I've got autonomous agents out in the field in a geographic territory, and I need to make sure they're motivated to sell my product, so I'll give them a commission, and I'll apply a quota to them so that they're motivated. Dan Pink and a whole bunch of other people have proved now, beyond any doubt, that financial motivations aren't necessarily what drives people. So the whole question of what motivates someone, is it the intrinsic, empowerment, autonomy and purpose, or is it a financial incentive? I don't think it's a financial incentive.
Well, that's a long ways, 1800s from the days of Amazon, and perhaps, it's time to look at, would you say it's time to look at some of the other things that incentivize other teams, for example, because, whether you're in marketing or customer success or the development product team, there's very rarely a commission built into that. How can those other teams serve as a model, in your view, and how can they help integrate the sales reps into this new system?
Yeah. Well, look, the first point to make is, the days of just having a blanket comp plan that is spread across everybody in the sales world is a bit lame now too. It's not very sophisticated, is it? Everyone's talking about how do you customize individual rewards, individual development plans, individual, career succession and all of those things. And everybody's motivated differently. If I said, sorry, I've just lost my microphone there. If I said, to you, Skylar, how would you like to, upon certain performance measurements, how would you like to have a day off a month? That might be appealing to you. Or how would you like to take your wife or girlfriend on a weekend away? Or, how would you just like a big chunk of commission? Everybody's got a slightly different view on those things. So I think tailoring rewards to individuals is a smart way to go.
Understood. And I think now would be an appropriate time to pull in an audience question. We have a question from Mr. Scott Marker, all the way from the United States. A very early good morning again to Mr. Marker. And quote, he says, "I have been looking for 2 years. Where have you found successful companies in 2017 and 2018 that have made this change you're talking about, and what does it look like? Something other companies can model." And this really comes back down to, the philosophy of no quotas, no commissions. Is it strictly a philosophy, or are there real world practical examples of industry leaders who are making ground with this?
Yeah, there are some good examples. And firstly, let me say, good morning, Mr. Marco. Good to see that you're on the line. I think I mentioned Scott and I go back a long way, and can't wait to see your book, my friend. In answer to that question, which is a good question, I'm seeing more and more of the, I guess you'd call, new businesses starting out without commission. And there's a number of examples. I know Trello, there's a company down here in Australia called Culture Amp. Their global VP of sales is a gentleman named Ramon Elzinga. And Ramon put out a fantastic post recently about their experience in building their sales team with a zero commission structure. You can find that post on LinkedIn under Culture Amp. Look for Ramon. That's a classic example of a business that's really doing some great things. He said in that post, and I can quickly summarize for you, he said their experience was in having zero commission for their sales team, that they've built a much more buyer-centric process as the first thing. They've removed individual targets that opens up a path for collaboration with other parts of the business. Skylar, we talked briefly about that divide between sales and everybody else. Certainly sales and marketing, there's always been that sort of Chinese wall, and customer success. I think when you remove those individual quotas and commissions, you can get to a point where all functions can collaborate much more effectively. And certainly that was the experience with Culture Amp, and being able to be helpful in attracting talent. Sometimes salespeople don't want to be a lone wolf. Sometimes they don't want to be out in the field measured, in those old ways. Sometimes they would like to be part of a team. So that's not always the right thing for some, but certainly that's the experience down here. So look, there's a lot of examples of businesses. I believe AWS, Amazon Web Services themselves, are now moving towards, rewarding people with equity in the company upon certain milestones being achieved, as opposed to commission. Now, as an example that's close to home for me, one of my clients down here in Australia, we recently set up a sales team based on no commission. It was interesting. We interviewed a guy who's my age, who's like me, spent his entire life earning commission. And at the end of the interview process, we said, now let's talk compensation. And myself and the CEO explained to him that our philosophy is zero commission, and quotas that will be based on all of those customer loyalty, retention metrics that we talked about earlier. And bear in mind, this is a guy who's been used to earning commission. And we said to him, so what do you think of that? He said, hallelujah, quote unquote, hallelujah, I've been looking for this type of compensation plan my whole life. So this guy, once he's passed his 6-month probation, he is allocated a tranche of equity options, and upon certain tenure measurements and certain performance measurements, that set of options grows. So he's not only aligned with the company and helping to build the company and being rewarded for his success, but he's aligned with their buyers and making sure that the buyers stick around and come back and repeat purchase. And so, yeah, look, I'm convinced that this is the way the world's headed. Jump on and have a look at Dan Pink's TED Talk. I think it's a brilliant TED Talk for those of your viewers that haven't seen it. It's had 19 million views or something now. It talks about motivation, and it talks about the fact that people are not necessarily, some are, but most are not necessarily motivated by a commission.
No, it comes back to that intrinsic motivation and seeing the diversity of interests and passions people have. And, you know, a lot of those examples that you gave were more, you know, the younger companies outside of Amazon Web Services that are starting this. Do you think this is something that can really catch fire with the big players too? I mean, it came out several years ago that even the likes of Apple are not focused on paying direct commissions to their salespeople in their Apple stores. Is this something that we could begin to see at a larger scale than just the new innovators?
Yeah, look, I think it's inevitable, Skylar. I think everybody's going to be forced. You know, the balance of power, the pendulum has swung to the buyer, and it's never coming back. And, you know, I think inevitably all businesses will have to go down this path in order to remain competitive. You can't have, you know, the innovators with the. I saw a great graph recently. There's a company here in Australia called Atlassian. Rough numbers, they did $320 million worth of software sales last year with no salespeople. So, you know, the businesses are now focusing on the cost of acquisition versus lifetime customer value ratio. And what that means is they're looking at ways that they can serve their customers more cost effectively. And so, yeah, Apple, all of the big corporations eventually will have to go that way. Now, having said that, I'm not deluded into thinking that that's an easy change either. We're talking about massive cultural change. It's a big shift. So I think the bigger, you know, traditional legacy organisations are going to find this shift fairly hard. I tried to do it recently, 4 years ago, with a large multinational organisation, and I ran up against a bunch of CFOs and finance people that just didn't like the concept. So it's not easy to convince people to go down this path, but I think it's inevitable.
Now, are there certain, you talk about it being a cultural shift, are there certain countries and even industries that are more likely to adopt this kind of a mindset or that are more likely to benefit from it?
Good question. Not 100% sure about that. I think, you know, certainly, as I said, I think the startups of the world and the new businesses now are already going down this path. I'm not sure whether, you know, there's specific industries. You know, we had this little example recently here in Australia where the real estate industry, which is, you know, always been based on commission, has recently been disrupted by a new player called Purple Bricks. And in fact, their tagline is they're basically creating a model where there's just a set fee. There's no commission, and, you know, you upload your photos of your property and you do a lot of the work, and so it's a much cheaper way for people to sell their property. Their tagline is save the commisery. In other words, remove the commission and save the misery of commission. So, I mean, in a way, that says it all.
Very true. Very true. I mean, it's obviously changing across industries, and it doesn't sound like there's anyone in the long term that is necessarily immune to it.
I don't think so. I think the buyer is in control in every industry, and eventually, you know, the power of natural market forces and the buyer's tastes and preferences changing so much will just mean that everybody will have to fall in line eventually.
Fair enough. And now here's a big one. We have sales leaders worldwide listening in and tuning in today. How can these company leaders take the first steps toward this? Say that they are convinced, or say that they want more information about this kind of thing. Well, what are the first concrete steps they can make, and how can they see this kind of scale of change management, organizational change, through to the end?
It's a good question. I always encourage my clients to do the most obvious thing, and that is go and talk to some buyers. You know, get a handful of buyers in and talk to them about what they think. In the research phase of both my books, I spent a lot of time interviewing, long-form interviews with buyers, and I was asking these questions consistently. And as I mentioned at the outset, the feedback from buyers was overwhelming. And I think if sales leaders out there, regardless of industry, regardless of segment, regardless of product category, whatever, just go and talk to some buyers to begin with. Get some feedback, some empirical feedback, and some evidence that you can bring back in-house. Take that to the senior management people. If you don't get senior management buy-in, and you'll never affect change if you don't create a sense of urgency. I mean, that's two of Quotas, you know, change management principles. So those would be my suggestions. Go and get some feedback, talk to some people, have a look at your cost of customer acquisition versus lifetime customer value ratio. Your CFO will know all about that. It should be 3 to 1 at a bare minimum, if not more. So collect some of the data, take it upstairs to the CEO and the C-suite, and create a sense of urgency around some change. And then be prepared for the battle, because it's going to take some time.
And speaking of that battle, obviously, there are a lot of sales reps that are entrenched in this system, and some are new to the scene. Some have been around for decades, going by quotas and commissions. What would be your concise pitch to them, or rather these company leaders' pitch to them to explain these changes and why they would be happening? How would you get the sales reps themselves on board?
Well, I wrote about some of that, Skylar, in the book, and my view of the future can be viewed in some cases as a somewhat bleak view for salespeople, because, as I mentioned, we really haven't seen a lot of change since John H. Patterson first developed the sort of fundamentals for sales that we're now still using 130 years later. And I think, in the last 5 years, we've seen more change for salespeople specifically than we have in the last century. So salespeople are grappling with all sorts of change now. When you look at simple measurements like the average staff tenure, 16.8 months now, people are turning over constantly in these roles. Nobody in the sales world in B2B is feeling overly secure these days. CSO Insights said that over and above the 16.8 months of average tenure, only 5% of salespeople stay in the same role for any longer than 3 years. And that's totally different to when I started. When I first started selling, you knew that the first year was all about developing some relationships. You knew you weren't going to make your quota in the first year. You would hope like hell you'd hit the number in the second year, and then you'd start to harvest in years 3 and 4 and 5, and you'd be there for 5 years. But that's not the case anymore. We've got massive rates of change. So one of the things I say in the book that's imperative for salespeople is that they have to specialize. They have to become, in the buyer's eyes, they have to become specialists that can lead with insight, create commercial insight, and be valuable to the buyer. Now, whether that means at the end of the process you get paid a big chunk of change called a commission, or does the buyer, or are you more likely to be rewarded and your career enhanced because the buyers come back and said, Skylar was an amazing account manager. We'd be happy to be a reference. We'll be a testimonial customer or an anchor customer for you because he's done such a good job of helping us solve problems. I'm not sure if there's a clear answer in all of that, but I think you get the drift.
Of course, a lot of it's uncharted territory, and it's going to obviously be very, specific to each organization. And one point that you brought up in that is you said that there's much higher turnover with these reps moving on 2 to 3 years rather than building this network the old school way. Is this potentially this no commissions, no sales, pulling them into no quotas, pulling them into more the customer success long-term view? Is that potentially a way for employers to keep their sales reps around longer?
Absolutely it is. If you think of SaaS models where we talked about earlier, these smaller transactions that go on and on, in order to be paid a commission or be rewarded for those longer term ongoing sales, you need to stay around longer. So put people on equity, as the likes of Culture Amp and Amazon Web Services are doing. Tie them into the company. If you've got talent, you want to retain that talent. Reward them appropriately. Mm-hmm. Make sure it's aligned with the buyers, the buyer outcomes, and of course, measure them on the right KPIs. It just seems, in some ways, it seems so obvious. And I read that quote recently that resonated. It said, "Forgive yourself for not having the foresight to see what's now obvious in hindsight." And when I look back at my career, it's just now it's like, oh yeah, of course, it just seems so obvious that.
Right.
If you remove the quota, if you remove the commission, what would that do? It would make us all much more aligned with just making sure the buyer gets what they need.
No, it really is changing the core of the system, and as our listeners have heard directly from the mouth of Mr. Graham Hawkins here, potentially a solution for turnover reduction itself. So I think we'll go ahead and start wrapping this up here. Thank you so much for your time today, Graham. Now, if listeners want to get in touch with you, follow your work, or pick up your best-selling book, The Future of the Sales Profession, how can they do that?
Well, they can start with good old LinkedIn. I'm fairly prolific on LinkedIn and I'm easily found there. I publish quite a bit of content on LinkedIn. You can also find me at SalesTribe. There's an absolute wealth of articles and good content on SalesTribe. We pride ourselves on being, a conventional approach to sales. Despite my long history in B2B sales, I've kind of wiped the slate clean, Skylar, almost. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the content and a lot of the thought leadership that we're bringing to the market is based on this modern, future-looking view. You can buy the book on Amazon. It's an international bestseller now. Just type in The Future of the Sales Profession and you'll find that pretty easily. So, I'm fairly easily found. I'm on Twitter. I'm on all of the other social channels. But yeah, feel free to reach out anybody that would like any help with any of this. I've got some good experience in crafting and, changing sales culture through transformation and transformation programs. So yeah, feel free to reach out.
Again, thank you so much to all of our listeners. Check out SalesTribe.com. His book is an international bestseller, The Future of the Sales Profession, on Amazon. And of course, connect with Mr. Graham Hawkins on LinkedIn, very prolific on there. And of course, we'd love to hear more. Go ahead, continue, sorry.
I'm just going to say a quick shout out to my good friends in Paris, Mr. Loic Simon, the social selling forum guru, and all of my other friends that I've made since I met Loic. And obviously Incentive is a very innovative company there, Skylar. And although you've got that American accent, you're right there in the heart of France, and you can speak fluent French, right?
Yes, that is correct. Although, whenever we're interviewing an Australian, native Australian, I'm on board.
Excellent.
Great. So again, thank you for joining us. To all of our listeners who are interested more in the digital solutions for sales forces worldwide that Incentive can bring, we are the creators of the Digital Sales Coach, a revolutionary mobile app used by sales forces worldwide to boost productivity, as well as the sales engagement and motivation experts. You can visit incentive.com. That's incentive.com, incentive.com. So thank you for tuning in. We will continue this webinar series throughout the month of February, and please continue to refer back to us for a complete list of many free resources that can help improve sales organizations worldwide. Thank you to all. Merci à tous for our French listeners, and from Paris, signing off till next time.